This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Sue Herrera.
Gaining strength, jobless claims fall, housing starts climb, inflation finds its footing. The numbers say the economy is looking up, but not everyone is feeling it. Attention Walmart investors, the world's largest retailer is entering the crucial holiday season on a slightly disappointing note. What's old may be new again. Remember the bridge to nowhere? Well, some lawmakers want to spend again on specific pet projects. Those stories and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Thursday, November 17th. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sue Herrera. Tyler Matheson is off tonight. The economy is revving. Today, the government released some of the best economic data on jobs, housing, and inflation in years, in some cases, decades. Here's what we learned. The labor market is strengthening. Jobless claims, a proxy for layoffs, tumbled to a level not seen since Richard Nixon was in office. Home construction is also ramping up, rising at its fastest pace since 2007. Inflation, something the Federal Reserve has been searching for, is showing signs of firming. But across America, as we know, there is an economic divide, with many feeling uncertain about their economic future. And the upbeat picture we got today may not tell the whole story. Call it the data disconnect. Today's consumer price numbers, up. Housing starts, up. And jobless claims, a proxy for layoffs, down, now at 43-year lows. They're among the most positive economic reports in decades. Those numbers do explain why Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen says an interest rate hike may be imminent. What they don't explain is the unrest President-elect Trump successfully mined in last week's election. Take consumer prices, up in October by nearly 0.5% from a month earlier, a jump driven by higher gas and electricity costs. Housing prices are up too, but food and medical costs are relatively flat. Year to year, prices are up more than 1.5%, the biggest gain in 2 years, and not far from the Fed's 2% target, a number we haven't seen in 4 years. The Fed benchmarks 2% as a sign of growth, with a relatively low risk of sudden price spikes. The Labor Department's Consumer Price Index isn't the only price measure used by the Fed. It also uses the Commerce Department's Personal Consumption Index, and that's been up as well. In September, it was up more than 1%, the biggest jump in almost 2 years. October's number is due later this month. Despite the higher prices, consumers are buying. Wages rose in October, the most since mid-2009. And retail spending is up in each of the past 2 months. Housing construction is up as well. Today, we learned housing starts jumped in October more than 25%, the most in 9 years, fueled by a boom in multifamily starts, up almost 75%. Housing permits, a measure of future construction, were up too, though not nearly as much. And finally, jobless claims dropped last week, down to their lowest levels since 1973, well below expectations. So why then, with jobs safe, wages up, and housing construction going strong, is the mood of the country so foul, the cry for change so loud? The numbers reflect a recovery, but it's an uneven recovery, not mirrored in places where jobs remain scarce and opportunity is lacking. And we have picked up on some of those fault lines dividing the country, from geography to education to ethnicity, and it gives us some insight as to where the recovery is being felt and where it is not. Noah Bierman, national and political reporter at the Los Angeles Times, joins us, as does Janet Adami, the news editor for the Wall Street Journal, where she writes about demographics for her economics team. Both of them during the campaign were all across the country talking to people in various walks of life. Welcome to both of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Noah, let me start with you. There was a line in one of your stories that really struck me. It says, this divide was as wide as any in recent history between those who believe Donald Trump will destroy everything America stands for and those who are certain it's already so destroyed that Trump is the only one who can fix it. And that really crystallizes the huge divide that we have between maybe the two coasts and middle America.
Yeah, I think just from speaking to people, obviously they didn't always put it quite in those terms, but you really had just a sharp division about how people felt about the country, how people thought that their friends were, people at Trump rallies didn't know a single person who voted for Clinton. Clinton supporters didn't know a single person who voted for Trump. You really had sharp divisions, and that would be in their Facebook groups, but also their neighborhoods and all these places where we congregate now. And you definitely see, and I found that your report really interesting on the data, because you're right, it wasn't necessarily just people who were in lower income categories that voted for Trump, right? But Gallup had some really interesting polling about a month ago that said it was a measure of those who felt economically insecure were more likely to vote for Trump across income levels. So a lot of this division was really just in your personal feeling of security.
And Janet, that goes to some of the demographics that you discovered when you were in Wisconsin, at Arcadia, Wisconsin. That economy is actually above average, but people there felt that they still couldn't get a leg up, and average wasn't so great anyway.
That's right, Sue. I think one thing that you can't discount in all this is the role that rapid demographic change has played in, particularly in the upper Midwest. We did an analysis of census data where we found that the places that have diversified the fastest in the U.S. over the last 15 years are small towns in a kind of a core part of the Midwest: Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana. And what we found was that, surprisingly, wage growth in these areas was slightly above average. Unemployment was a little bit lower. These are towns where, they have some manufacturing jobs. Immigrants have been moving in. And so while people in those towns, the job market was fairly robust, there was a lot of, people felt very unsettled about just how quickly their towns had changed. I think to us it was a sign that immigration really struck a chord in some of these places.
Which, of course, Mr. Trump ran very heavily on. Noah, let me go back to you. You say that some of the people that you talked to gave you the indication that there were two Americas. And as a result of that, they were willing to take a bet on voting perhaps for Mr. Trump because Mrs. Clinton had been in the establishment for so long. They were looking for change.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think Trump, the persona, also, we can't discount that. If you look at Mitt Romney from 4 years ago, these feelings were still there, a lot of them quite strongly, but Democrats were much more successful at portraying Mitt Romney as much more disconnected than the Democrats. And they pointed to his lack of support for the auto bailout, and that was clearly a big area of, where the auto bailout was more popular, was where Trump did well. And they, highlighted his 47%. Trump, even though he had certainly wealth like Romney did, wasn't able to be portrayed that way. And I think that was a big deal, because I don't know that all these things are necessarily have to do with short-term cyclical economic indicators. I think they're long-term fundamental changes in the economy and the demographics that people are rebelling against.
And Janet, does the long-term view that Noah just outlined gel with what you were seeing when you crisscrossed the country and talked to people that were undergoing large demographic changes in their communities?
One thing I actually heard a lot about was the idea of playing by the rules, that particularly whites in these areas who had seen a lot of Latinos move in, they felt like they had, in some of these communities in Arcadia, there was a significant number of illegal immigrants. They felt like they were, they had been there a long time, they were working hard, and yet they saw Latinos coming in who were crowding the schools. They talked about how Latinos qualified for assistance at the food pantry. They qualified for heating assistance. There was a lot of resentment among people who, who had jobs, they were working, and yet they didn't feel like maybe they had the financial success that they wanted, that they had, in their words, kind of done what you were supposed to do in America, and yet there were other people who were coming in and they were getting help. So I heard a lot about fairness when I talked to people in Arcadia, Wisconsin.
All right, well, complicated issues all the way around. Noah Bierman with the Los Angeles Times, Janet Adami with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you both. We appreciate your perspective.
Thanks
My
for
pleasure,
having me.
Sue.
Following today's solid economic data, Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen told Congress's Joint Economic Committee that the economy is making very good progress and that a rise in interest rates could come relatively soon. Steve Leisman has more.
Fed Chair Janet Yellen cast aside doubts that she could possibly resign under the new president, saying in no uncertain terms she would complete her term.
I was confirmed by the Senate to a 4-year term, which ends at the end of January of 2018, and it is fully my intention to serve out that term.
Yellen's comments before the Joint Economic Committee were her first since the election. They followed a campaign in which President-elect Donald Trump harshly criticized her and the Fed for being political and inflating financial bubbles. But Yellen extended no olive branch to Trump, warning against political interference with the central bank. She said such interference had led to terrible outcomes in other countries. She also spoke out against the president-elect's plans to scrap Dodd-Frank, the financial regulatory reform bill, saying she did not want the clock turned back on improvements to the banking system. And Yellen cautioned against apparent plans by Trump to enact a package of massive tax cuts and huge spending programs that could ramp up the deficit.
Such a package could have inflationary consequences that the Fed would have to take into account in devising policy.
That could potentially mean faster rate hikes from the Fed because Yellen believes the economy is already near full employment and doesn't require stimulus like it was near a recession. So the Fed could be headed for a confrontation with the new president if he slams on the gas pedal with fiscal policy, and the Fed thinks it has to simultaneously hit the brakes. As it is, Yellen gave her strongest comments yet that the Fed was set to hike in December. She said a rate hike could be appropriate relatively soon and warned of the dangers of not hiking fast enough, saying that could undermine financial stability and encourage excessive risk-taking. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Steve Leisman.
That testimony from the Fed chair helped push stocks within striking distance of all-time highs. Those comments sent bond yields higher, which rise when investors expect higher interest rates, and that in turn helped lift the financial sector. The Dow Jones Industrial Average added 35 points to 18,903. The Nasdaq was up 39, and the S&P 500 rose 10. Shares of Walmart weighed on the blue chip index. The world's largest retailer reported better than expected earnings and during the latest quarter, but its sales fell short of what some on Wall Street had projected. That sent shares of the Dow component down more than 3%. Courtney Reagan breaks down Walmart's quarter.
The good news is Walmart's comparable sales are positive for the 9th straight quarter. Online sales also grew at the fastest rate in 7 quarters. The not so good news, persistent deflationary pressures in food hurt Walmart's comparable sales, and grocery is more than 50% of Walmart's business. And while in-store foot traffic improved over last year, it was at a slower rate than last quarter. Walmart's holiday sales guidance is below analysts' expectations, and the holiday quarter is the most important of the year. Walmart is playing catch-up in its e-commerce business, and while it's still early to evaluate the full potential of its recent acquisition of Jet.com, Guggenheim analyst Robert Durbel is optimistic the right moves are being made.
They're being, very proactive with the Jet acquisition, with a lot of the investments that they're making, with their infrastructure in place, with JD.com in China. They're really trying to approach the business from 2 sides. One is keep the store operations humming along, and they're doing a solid job with that. And the second is to really stay focused on the e-commerce opportunity that the company has in front of it.
While large investments will constrain near-term profit growth, Chief Financial Officer Brett Biggs told me he classifies the quarter as strong across the board in the U.S., pointing to Walmart's continuing story of transforming the business from a position of strength. Biggs and U.S. CEO Greg Foran say there was no material impact on consumer spending patterns ahead of or as a result of the election. In general, economic data continues to set up a landscape for healthy consumer spending, and analysts tend to agree.
I think that the consumer has had the ability to spend, has a healthy, there's an income statement, if you will. And I think that we've been waiting for them to make the trip to the store and start to spend. And of course, Christmas will always come. So I sense a bit of cautious optimism here across the retail landscape.
And with Thanksgiving and Black Friday weekend looming just a week away, what more could Walmart ask for? For Nightly Business Report, I'm Courtney Reagan.
New account openings at Wells Fargo fell more than 40% in October compared to a year ago. The bank also said applications for credit cards plunged 50% last month, following a 35% decline in September. Wells Fargo attributed the plunge to backlash over the fake account scandal, and the bank's new head of community banking said, quote, "We have work to do." J.P. Morgan has agreed to pay more than $260 million to resolve allegations it improperly hired unqualified children of China's ruling elite. It is alleged that the bank did this to win lucrative business from those in power. Regulators say J.P. Morgan used its hiring tactics to corruptly influence government officials. Still ahead, the economic ties that bind the world's first and third largest economies. Federal prosecutors filed charges in a kickback scheme against Valeant. The charges allege that the ex-CEO of specialty pharmacy Philidor, Andrew Davenport, secretly paid former Valeant executive Gary Tanner $10 million to steer Valeant's business and to potentially acquire Philidor. Manhattan U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara said together the two were partners in crime.
Tanner worked with Davenport to build up Philidor, but sometimes at the expense of Valeant. For example, although Tanner was directed to diversify Valeant's relationships with multiple specialty pharmacies, he instead pushed hundreds of millions of dollars of Valeant business exclusively to Philidor. And as we intend to prove, he did it for the eventual $10 million kickback.
Tanner's attorney said he was charged with a crime for doing his job. Shares of Valeant finished the day with slight gains. Online orders power the results at Best Buy. That's where we begin tonight's Market Focus. The electronics retailer said online sales jumped 24%, and that contributed to a better-than-expected rise in profit and revenue. Same-store sales also came in above estimates, but the company did say that it expects to take a $200 million hit in the current quarter due to Galaxy Note 7 phone recalls. Shares rose 13% to $45.99. Revenue at J.M. Smucker fell more than analysts were expecting. Slower sales of pet food products like its Meow Mix, as well as its more traditional Jif peanut butter and Folgers coffee brands, hurt their results. Smucker shares were off nearly 4% to $124.85. Oil refiner Tesoro said it would buy rival Western Refining for about $4 billion in a deal that would give Tesoro a wide array of new assets in several states. That merger is expected to close in the first half of 2017. Western Refining soared 23% to $37.55, while Tesoro was also higher by nearly 1% at $86.56. Guggenheim cut Chipotle to sell from neutral, citing the potentially unrealistic expectations set for growth at the burrito chain. The firm sees downside risk ahead for the company and also expects new domestic store openings to slow. Guggenheim also lowered its price target on the stock to $315. But Chipotle shares were unchanged on the day at $402.90. There are reports tonight that Apple has asked some of its manufacturing partners to look into ways to bring the iPhone assembly chain into the U.S. Right now, all iPhones are manufactured in China. President-elect Donald Trump said he will force Apple to build its products in the U.S. But the report also says that domestic production of iPhones means the costs could more than double. President-elect Trump is meeting and hosting his first foreign leader in a high-stakes meeting. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe arrived at Trump Tower in New York this evening. One topic on the agenda, trade, specifically the controversial Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump campaigned against. And the meeting highlights the importance of the relationship between the world's first and third largest economies. Susan Lee reports.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe became the first head of state to have a face-to-face with the president-elect Donald Trump. In a hastily arranged meeting, Abe was eager to revisit ties with its strongest ally, the U.S., and its soon-to-be new leader in an alliance of trust, as he has called it. Japan is the world's third largest economy and America's fourth largest trading partner, with close to $200 billion worth of goods exchanged between the two countries last year. The Asian nation was also central to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a TPP trade deal, which now looks to be shelved under a Trump administration. And that would deal a blow to Japan's efforts to counter a rising Chinese economy and military power. Security is another key issue between the two, with Japan and the U.S. allies since the signing of a treaty in 1960. However, in a threat to ongoing security relations, the president-elect has warned that he might pull U.S. forces out of Japan unless Japan paid for its presence. There are an estimated 54,000 troops currently stationed in the country, costing $5 billion annually, according to one measure. Japan argues that it pays a substantial portion of this cost. Trump has also suggested that Japan pursue its own nuclear arsenal in order to defend itself against rising tensions in the Pacific. With questions surrounding the U.S.-Japan security relationship, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has already moved to try to repeal some of the country's pacifist constitution. This meeting is seen as an early indication as to the future of U.S.-Japan relations, but it's also being closely watched by others across the Asia-Pacific, looking for clues as to how the next U.S. president will handle foreign relations. For Nightly Business Reports, I'm Susan Lee.
Lawmakers may be flirting with the idea of ending the ban on earmarks, which is money usually tucked into spending bills that an individual lawmaker stipulates should be put towards a specific project. The ban has been in effect for 6 years, but as Hampton Pearson reports, some on Capitol Hill would like to bring them back.
When Vice President-elect Mike Pence met with House Republicans today, the focus was on a legislative strategy to jumpstart the Trump agenda, likely to include massive infrastructure spending and tax cuts. House Speaker Paul Ryan says that toolkit might include a return of earmarks, the old Washington practice of allowing lawmakers to target spending on specific pet projects.
Our members are worried that the executive branch, unelected bureaucrats, have been given far too much power, and that we've seen violence done to the separation of powers. So restoring the power of the purse truly to the legislative branch so that elected officials can hold the unelected branch of government more accountable is what is the genesis of that concern.
10 years ago, earmarks were viewed as a symptom of out-of-control spending, including a $1 million Woodstock Museum in New York, championed by then-Senator Hillary Clinton and Senator Chuck Schumer, and former Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, fighting for years for $223 million to build what became known as the Bridge to Nowhere. Ironically, it was 6 years ago this week that former House Speaker John Boehner pushed through a moratorium.
Today, Republicans adopted an earmark ban.
Now, outside conservative groups are sounding the alarm. Worried lawmakers are missing the call for change from voters who just elected Donald Trump.
It's troubling that after an election on Tuesday where the voters clearly said they wanted to change Washington, that Republicans might be moving back towards one of the most egregious examples of how Washington was broken, which is earmarking.
Of course, the biggest X factor going forward is right now we really don't know what President-elect Donald Trump will have to say about the possible return of congressional earmarks. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Hampton Pearson on Capitol Hill.
Coming up, small business matters. Will a Trump administration rev up this engine of economic growth and job creation? Complicated rules, onerous regulations, high tax rates. Those are just some of the things that small business owners say are holding them back from expanding or hiring. But with promises of deregulation, will there be changes under a Trump White House? Kate Rogers has our story.
Obamacare has to be replaced, and we will do it, and we will do it very quickly.
Donald Trump campaigned hard on the notion of easing government regulations like the Affordable Care Act. Now the president-elect's message of deregulation is striking a hopeful chord on Main Street. Government regulations consistently rank as a top issue for America's smallest companies, coming in only behind the rising cost of health insurance this year, according to the National Federation of Independent Business.
The number of regulations coming out of Washington over the past decade has caused a lot of uncertainty, created new costs, and has hurt small businesses in terms of their competitiveness. So the surge in regulation is something that Washington really needs to address and the new administration needs to address.
Getting to work on Obamacare is a priority for both Trump and small business advocates.
We're very much advocates of getting rid of the employer mandate as part of the repeal and replace of Obamacare. Studies have clearly shown that the employer mandate does not increase overall health insurance coverage. All it really does is increase costs and regulatory burdens on employers.
Another burden coming down the pike on December 1st, the Department of Labor's new overtime regulations, which enable an additional 4 million salaried workers across the country to become eligible for overtime. The rule was put in place by the Obama administration in the face of a stagnant federal minimum wage at $7.25 an hour since 2009.
Doubling the threshold from just over $23,000 to $46,000 is going to really impact many of our members, particularly in low-cost areas of the country. So we would like this to be fixed.
Finally, Main Street is also closely watching the wage debate, with 29 states and Washington, D.C. currently requiring wages above the federal floor. On election night, higher wages were approved in 4 more states by the year 2020. President-elect Trump had spoken out in support of a $10 an hour federal minimum wage while on the campaign trail, but small business advocates are hopeful that raising the wage won't be a priority for the new administration. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Kate Rogers.
And that is Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Sue Herrera. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you here tomorrow.